As I've been watching more NBA games, more and more teams have either been blowing leads or absolutely dominating. The MVP race has gotten closer, players are scoring higher, and I've started to hear the question thrown around a couple times. Has the league become more competitive? It's even more prevalent with Adam Silver stating that he wants the league to be more competitive and to do things like stop tanking. Now, this is a loaded question. If I were to ask who the most competitive of all time is, most of you would probably point to rivalries, such as Bill Russell versus Wilt Chamberlain, Magic versus Bird, Jordan versus Thomas, or even more recently, the Cavs versus the Warriors. It was easy to notice when a game is competitive with the eye tests, but what about the numbers? Over nearly the past year of making this video, I dived deeper into this question, calculating and finally coming up with a mathematically proven answer of which season was the most competitive. All that was left was to make it into a video. This took a lot of effort. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and shared it around. I know that's a cliche thing that everyone says, but guys, I almost drove myself insane making this. So please share my channel or the video around if you felt this was informative or entertaining. Anyway, let's go through this together and look at this question through a lens made by the numbers.
Finn, you're terrible at math.
Now I think the most logical place people would start is points. I, as well as many others, have made the point about the shift the NBA has made to offense. More points, more shots beyond the arc, and more players breaking records. The NBA offensive rating, or average points a team makes per game, is 112.3 right now. The last time the offensive rating was under 100 was 1976, when it was 99.5. The last time it was even under 105 was 2012, when it was barely at 105. And before then, 2004 at 102.9. But does this really matter in the context of being competitive? Sure, you score more, but what really matters is how you score versus someone else. In 1997, Roth Lawler, broadcaster of the Los Angeles Clippers, stated that the team that scores 100 first wins the game. Except, this rule is expired. As it may seem obvious, with the offensive rating of the league, it just isn't the same anymore. I mean, how could the 100-point rule still apply when players themselves are scoring more than half that just as one person? Just in these first few months of the season, we've seen Curry, Paul George, Tatum, and Embiid drop 40, Damian Lillard drop 2 41s, DeRozan 46, Curry another 47, Morant at 49, and so on, even including a few 50 points recently. Luckily, for our convenience, there's a website that tracks when Lawler Law is broken, or every time the team with 100 first loses. For the past couple decades, the Lawler Law has worked around 93% of the time, but for the first time, it dipped below 92% to 90% in 2016, and it has continued to decrease to a record low 87% in 2018, and has stayed below 90% ever since. The average of the past 6 years is 89%. With the 6 years before that averaging to 93.5%. The Lawler Law was so popular that even the Los Angeles Times themselves did an article on it, reporting on its accuracy. The LA Times luckily made graphs so I didn't have to, and it should be no surprise that as 100-point games have gone up, the Lawler Law outliers have increased. This article goes on to compare today's game to when the law was created, saying, now, if you score 100 points, you didn't score a lot. It also goes on to say nowadays, people might be hitting 100 with 9 minutes left in the fourth quarter. There's still a lot of game to play. The Los Angeles Times finishes off the article by saying the new law is first to 114, a whole 14-point increase from the original 100-point rule. And if we look at the offensive ratings between teams, it's clear to see that as the seasons go on, the teams are just scoring more and more. Well, okay then. Maybe the team to 100 first doesn't win anymore. That was pretty obvious. So what else can we use to see if the league has become more competitive? How about how close are the standings and winning the championship? Well, if we look at the difference in standings, many have brought up how close both the East and the West have been towards the top. But let's be more specific than just saying it's close. If we look at the standings throughout the years, there wouldn't seem to be much difference in playoff seed teams, that being the 1st to the 8th seed. In fact, if we look at the average difference between the 1st and the 8th seed in the past 2 decades, it's the exact same. However, this past season, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th seed were all tied in terms of win-loss. We've seen teams been tied a couple times this decade, but it's usually towards the middle of the 5th to the 7th seed. But let's look even a little closer. The difference between the 1st and the 8th seed in the East hasn't ever dropped below 12 in the almost 2 decades, until this year. This year, the difference between the East 1st and the East 8th seed was 10. The last time the difference was even a single digit was 8 in 2003. The year LeBron James was drafted, the Thunder were still the Supersonics, and when the Nets were still from New Jersey and not Brooklyn. For an even bigger change to be seen, we have to look towards the bottom of the conference, which often gets ignored. The average difference between the 8th and the 10th seed for both the East and West team have decreased by a decent margin, especially recently with the addition of the play-in. Before, once it was made clear a team wouldn't make the playoffs, there was no real reason to give intensity, but instead to lose to help draft odds. Now, with the addition of the play-in, no one is truly out of contention until the very end, causing even the 10th and 11th seed teams to try and close the gap between the 8th seed. Nice thinking, Adam. But let's move past the offense. We started talking about how much the league has shifted towards offense. But what about defense? Well, the average defensive rating did decrease this season, meaning that the team has been playing better defensively. I've talked about the reverse bell curve many times, with defense increasing as a weakness of it decreasing before. The defensive rating, similar to the offensive rating, however, doesn't really tell us much specifically on its own. A team can be playing amazingly on offense and have bad defense, but that doesn't mean they aren't being competitive by not playing defensively. And the inverse is also true. An interesting stat to look at instead is actually the net rating. A net rating for the team is the difference between their defensive and offensive rating, or the points a team scores on them versus the points they score instead. So thinking logically, a smaller net rating between teams would mean that the league is more competitive. The league last season has an average net rating of 16.6. We haven't seen it dip below 17 in over a decade. The last time the net rating was this low was in 2016, when it was 14.4. This was the era of Dirk Nowitzki, the Spurs Big Three, the Houston Big Three, and LeBron in Cleveland. Now, we have one of the closest MVP races ever, with Jokic, Embiid, Giannis, Luka, and so on. Obviously, this net rating is a huge indicator in the terms of competitiveness for the league, numbers-wise. Again, the smaller the net rating is, the better teams are playing on both sides, the less they are letting teams score on them, and the more they are scoring competitively with each other, and the closer the win is in terms of points. Now, I know I just threw a lot of numbers at you, but this is where we get into the nitty-gritty. Anyone could have gotten the offensive ratings, plugged them into a calculator, and gotten an average to compare them. But now we're about to get into some stats that not many people watch, or even stats that aren't even calculated online, and which I had to do by hand. This is where all my 4 cups of coffee, missed homework, calculus, mental deterioration, blood, skin, and bones went into.
Stress? We're talking about stress, okay? I've stumbled onto a major company conspiracy, Mac. How about that for stress? What the hell are you talking about? This company is being bled like a stuffed pig, Mac, and I got a paper trail to prove it. Check this out. Take a look at this.
Jesus Christ,
That right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay? Pepe Sylvia. This name keeps coming up over and over again. Every day, Pepe's mail's getting sent back to me. Pepe Sylvia, Pepe Sylvia. I look in the mail. Well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia.
When we talk about competitiveness, I think most people's idea would whittle down to how close the games are specifically. We look at the offense and defensive ratings and get an idea, but how hard are teams truly fighting for a win on a daily basis? An easy way to quantify this is by margin of victory, as well as the lead changes, overtime games, and the average playoff length. If the margin of win is smaller, then more teams squeaked by each other by fewer points. Same with overtime games. And the more game 6s or game 7s there are in a playoff season compared to game 4s or game 5s means that it was a more competitive playoff. When evaluating the margin of victory, one of the biggest sources was Red Band Sports, but they only recorded it up until 2019, unfortunately. Throughout the years, the margin of victory actually stayed pretty consistent, except for the last year in 2019. In 2019, we see a theme that looks similar to the offensive rating. The margin of victory jumped by almost a full point, and the median did jump by a full point. Red Band Sports also tracked the games where the margin of victory was over 20 points. In 2018 to 2019, it jumped from 0.13 to 0.20, which is an insane increase. As for the playoff games, they also stayed pretty consistent except for a large dip in 2017, which this makes sense as this was the Clash of the Titans finals. So the biggest series was going to be the finals between the LeBron Cavs and the Curry Warriors, and every other playoff team was easy to see who the winner would be if they played either the Cavs or the Warriors. Our biggest trend to see is actually in the overtime games. The amount of overtime games has steadily decreased, and I think that's again due to the importance put on offense rather than defense. Overtimes used to be in the hundreds per season, and now it's considered high if it even gets into the 90s. Sure, there are some years you can put an asterisk next to the graph for shortened seasons like 2020, but this still doesn't change the overall trend. Teams are just trying to outscore each other until the fourth quarter, where teams start to slow down and have less energy, which means not much energy leading to any overtime games. So with that being said, with all of the data collected, I think it's time that we announce what you've been waiting for. What season has been the most competitive? What season perhaps has been the least competitive? And how do they compare to this season? The least competitive season, after reviewing all the information, is the 2016 to 2017 season. As I said, this was the Warriors vs. Cavs finals. The net rating was high between teams as well as the margin of victory. Both the Warriors and the Cavs were in the top of the conference and no one was going to challenge them except for each other. The real competition was between Curry and LeBron, and nothing else really mattered. This season had the least amount of playoff games with 79, with the Warriors and Cavs breezing past everyone else. They had competition with each other leading to an exciting finals, but no one else really gave up a fighting chance. And I already see people now that are typing saying this contradicts some other videos I've made, such as what if Kawhi never got injured, where I stated that if Kawhi wasn't injured, the Spurs could have potentially won against the Warriors. But again, that's a what if, and even if the Spurs made it past the Warriors, they would have to also face the Cavs again. Now, With all these things considered, the 2016 to the 2017 season is mathematically the least competitive season in the past 2 decades. Now, let's go to the most competitive season. The most competitive season, in my opinion, and mathematically backed, is the 2017 to 2018 season. Yes, I know some of you are already screaming or scratching your heads confused. How can the 2017 season be the least competitive, but the season immediately after is the most competitive, especially when my main reason for the least competitive was the Cavs vs. Warriors finals, and the 2018 finals had the exact same teams. Well, again, let's take a step back and look at the numbers, and look at things in broader terms. When looking at the stats over the past decade, something rare happens in 2018. The offense and defensive rating both dropped. Teams were coming up with defensive strategies against these teams and making strategic plays and moves to simply play better and more competitive basketball. And by balancing the importance on both the offensive and defensive side of the floors, something remarkable happened. The net rating averaged out to be a perfect 0. Teams were being so perfectly balanced and competitive. No one's defense highly outshined the offense or vice versa. No teams were outscoring the others like crazy. All the teams seemed relatively even, again with a perfect net rating of 0. Even if we look at the standings, even though the Cavs and Warriors made it to the finals, their path was made much more difficult this year, with teams like Houston and Boston finishing with a better regular season record and taking both the Cavs and the Warriors to 7 games in the playoffs, increasing the number of playoff games from the low 79 that it was last year. While there was a slight decrease in overall time games overall this season, we begin to see more triple overtime or even 4 overtime games. There was also a slight dip in margin of victory all around, similar to the dip in offensive and defensive ratings. While some may disagree with me because of things like the Warriors super team sweeping the Cavs in the finals, this season was truly competitive mathematically, and this competitiveness, while being slightly diluted and not as present, carried over into the following seasons, like 2019, where Kawhi had an incredible finish against the 76ers, and the Raptors versus the Warriors was unforgettable. However, again, as time went on, this competition began to dwindle and dilute, leading to the 2017 to 2018 season being the most competitive season we've seen in recent history. Now, how does this season stack up? Well, originally, I wanted to release this video over the summer to compare it to the 2020 season in its entirety, but we'll use stats so far for the 2023 season. I can say that this season is more competitive than some of the other seasons since 2018. So far, the margin of victory has been pretty low and overtime games are on track to be high. However, as you might have guessed with people scoring 40 and 50 a night, the offensive rating and net rating are also very high. However, again, it's very early in the season, and one team in particular have been affecting these numbers greatly, with the Milwaukee Bucks tearing through the league and taking no prisoners, making it seem much less competitive. However, you could throw a dart at nearly any of these teams and say that they have a chance for a deep playoff run this year, with even the Jazz being top of the conference right now. With that being said, we'll just have to see what happens this season, and see how it compares to the others when it's all said and done. This season is going to be very exciting, and I look forward to seeing how competitive it is compared to the previous seasons. So far, we've already seen amazing displays of competition, but again, also some teams getting blown out, so we'll just have to see how it turns out in the end. Thank you all so much for watching, and again, this was a lot of research if you can imagine, so I'd greatly appreciate it if you liked the video or subscribed down below, or simply shared the video around so more people could see it. would greatly help me out. As you can see with how much research I put in, I do truly care about this channel and want to see it grow, despite my upload schedule due to work and school. But with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next video.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.